It seemed that the case in this video was impossible to solve. However, everything changed because of this photo. When a detective looked at it, he noticed something that later became the key to the conviction of the defendant. The story begins in Durham, North Carolina, with a young couple, Janet and Raven Abaroa. They met in 1998 at Southern Virginia University. During her time there, Janet was actively involved in sports, swimming, basketball, and soccer, which is how they met. Raven was also passionate about soccer, and the couple first encountered each other during one of the training sessions. Both later said it was love at first sight. Their relationship developed quickly, and just 2 years after they met, in August 2000, Janet and Raven got married. Afterward, they moved to the city of Durham, where this story begins. The choice of this city was largely due to the fact that there was a large sports company where they could easily find work. For some time, the couple's life seemed perfect, until a certain moment. In 2003, Raven confessed to Janet that he had cheated on her, not with just one woman, but with several. This should have been the end of their relationship. However, there was one thing. Shortly after the confession, Janet found out she was pregnant. She didn't want to raise a child as a single mother, and Raven swore that his infidelities were in the past. Thus, their marriage was given another chance. They both felt like things were improving, and on October 17, 2004, their son Caden was born. With the birth of their child, the Abaroa marriage seemed to be on the mend, but soon they faced another blow. As mentioned earlier, both Raven and Janet worked at a company that produced and sold sporting goods. In 2004, Raven was caught stealing 25 sports uniforms, which he later sold online. The company pressed charges against him, and there was no point in contesting them. Everything was too obvious. Raven pleaded guilty to the theft. He received probation, a $10,000 fine, and was fired from his job. Even though Janet wasn't involved in the theft, she left her job at the sports company as well. After her husband was fired for stealing, continuing to work there would have been a great embarrassment for her. By December 2004, both Raven and Janet were unemployed. Naturally, this led to serious financial problems for the couple. Finding a job with a theft conviction was difficult, but they still had bills to pay. The couple had some savings, and in addition, their landlord gave them a 3-month rent deferment, which helped ease their financial troubles, albeit only slightly. The next important date in this story is April 26, 2005, 4 months after Raven and Janet's unemployment began.
The lights are off, the door is cracked open, I thought I left it open. My baby's crying right now. How today? He was 6 months old. Exercise caution.
This was Raven Abaroa's 911 call on April 26, 2005 at 10:40 p.m. He hysterically reported that he had come home and found his wife Janet dead. According to him, she had shot herself. However, when police investigated the scene, they determined this wasn't the case. In fact, she had been stabbed, and it was clear that it didn't resemble a suicide at all. Janet had more than a dozen stab wounds, with the most likely fatal ones being to her neck. Adding to the tragedy was the fact that Janet was pregnant with their second child at the time. According to Raven's statements, at around 8 p.m., he had left for a soccer match. When he left home, his wife and child were already asleep. Returning at 10:40 p.m., he found Janet lying on the floor in a pool of blood. Their 6-month-old child was nearby, crying in his crib. Fortunately, the child had not been harmed by the attacker. Raven's laptop, as well as one of his knives, was missing from the house. Interestingly, Raven collected knives. However, despite the stolen laptop, Janet's rings remained untouched. Another important clue was a bloody shoe print found on the carpet in the room where Janet was killed. Despite all of this, the police found no signs of forced entry at the doors or windows. It was as if the attacker had entered the home without any difficulty, even though the door had been locked. All of this left the police at a dead end, and the investigation became even more complicated when, Just a few days after Janet's murder, her husband, Raven, moved to another state, Utah, nearly 3,000 kilometers from the crime scene. Perhaps there would have been nothing unusual about this. After all, it's not strange for a man to decide to relocate after his wife's murder. However, the problem was that Raven completely refused to cooperate with the police, who were trying to investigate his wife's murder. He immediately hired a lawyer and only communicated with detectives through him. But the most significant detail was that Janet's life was insured for $500,000. Even though the Abaroa family had been struggling to pay for their home, Raven never missed making the insurance payments. He always found money for those, even though his family needed more essential things at the time. There wasn't even a hint of another suspect in the case, which made Raven the only person with a clear motive. However, all of this was still not enough, and so, after Janet's murder, no one was arrested. After receiving the insurance payout, Raven started a new life in Utah. He also took their child with him. A few years after Janet's death, Raven, now in Utah, began dating a woman named Vanessa Pond. After some time, Raven proposed to Vanessa, and she accepted. Janet's family, her 6 sisters and 3 brothers, were fully convinced that Raven was involved in Janet's death. They reached out to Vanessa and tried to warn her that Raven might be dangerous. However, to Vanessa, he didn't seem that way. Throughout the time she had known him, he had been sincere and caring. Yes, she knew that his first wife had been murdered, but according to Raven, she had been killed by a burglar, and that explanation was enough for Vanessa. Raven and Vanessa got married in August 2008, but their marriage lasted only 4 months. As Vanessa later said, Raven's behavior changed drastically after the wedding. He would suddenly become aggressive, then apologize moments later. Moreover, at times, he would use physical force against her. According to Vanessa, she soon began to fear for her life, and doubts about his innocence in the death of his first wife, Janet, grew stronger. Her fear eventually led her to file for divorce. Meanwhile, Janet's family continued to express their suspicions about Raven's involvement in her death through various interviews. This eventually led to the case being reassigned to a new detective, Charles Sola, in 2009. The new detective, like the police before him, considered Raven the prime suspect in the murder of his wife. However, to charge him, the case needed either physical evidence or strong circumstantial evidence against him. While carefully reviewing the case, Detective Soul managed to find such evidence. The first clue came from a photo. In it, he noticed something that pointed him in the right direction. What was it? It was a small container of contact lens solution on the nightstand next to Janet's bed. Noticing this, the detective hypothesized that Janet wore contact lenses. Her family confirmed this, but the problem was that the lenses themselves were missing from the house. The lens container was empty, so why weren't the lenses found? The only explanation was that Janet hadn't removed them that evening. However, to be absolutely sure, they needed to exhume Janet's body 5 years after her death. With the family's permission, the police exhumed her body, and indeed the remains of the contact lenses were found on her eyes. So why was the discovery of the lenses on the victim's eyes so important? It was simple. It meant that Janet hadn't removed them, which indicated she hadn't gone to bed that evening, completely contradicting Raven's statement. Raven had told the police that his wife was asleep when he left the house, meaning his testimony was a lie. This ultimately led to his arrest. Raven Abaroa's trial began in May 2013. Although the prosecutor had no direct evidence against the defendant, there was an overwhelming amount of circumstantial evidence. First, there was the already mentioned lie about Janet being asleep when he left. This was just one of many contradictory statements made by Raven. Next, we recall that Raven's laptop was stolen from the house, yet Raven had a large number of disks containing backups of the data from the missing laptop. While backing up data is not necessarily suspicious, the problem was that these backups were made the day before the laptop went missing. Quite the coincidence, right? Additionally, on the night of Janet's murder, Raven, for some reason, locked the family dog in the garage, something he had never done before. From the prosecution's perspective, it looked as though Raven was afraid the dog would protect Janet. Furthermore, there were no signs of forced entry, and the room showed no signs of a struggle. Given that Janet was athletic, She would have likely put up some resistance unless the attacker was someone close to her, someone from whom she didn't expect an attack. Moreover, more than 5 women who had been involved with Raven at different points in his life testified in court, describing him as an aggressive man, someone they were afraid of. And then there was the motive, the insurance policy. Even while drowning in debt, Raven never missed an insurance payment. The defense, of course, argued that all of this was merely circumstantial evidence. The question was whether this evidence would be enough to convict Raven. In the end, the jury couldn't reach a unanimous decision. 11 jurors agreed that Raven was guilty, while 1 believed he was innocent. As a result, the judge declared a mistrial, and a new trial was scheduled. The new trial was set for March 2014, but before it began, Raven made a deal with the prosecution by submitting what's known as an Alford plea. In the US, an Alford plea means that the defendant agrees that the evidence presented points to their guilt. The defendant acknowledges that the evidence is sufficient for a conviction, but does not admit to committing the crime itself. To put it simply, the defendant says, "I refuse to admit that I committed this crime, but the evidence may convince the jury of my guilt, so I voluntarily plead guilty." This plea was part of a deal with the prosecution. In the end, Raven was found guilty of manslaughter and sentenced to 10 years in prison. The years he had already spent in jail awaiting trial were credited to him, and Raven was released in 2017. This case is certainly controversial, and everyone must decide for themselves whether the evidence against Raven was sufficient or not. However, this story is less about that, and more about the small detail of the contact lenses, which turned the case around 180 degrees.